Alright, I'm going to show you and do what's in my nibby. Dunga didn't your said, do what's in my nibby dunga, dumbody. And then Gavatella and the chick, one to big dunga you said. The number to big dimby dunga you said. I don't want to other do it dunga yes. Sanda, Odusin Angela Casandu Denigi. 강아 망고직 바슈체 디스 차상은 지가 하고 얘기 먼저 기티나 용도 해야 되는 거 하고 무슨 하고 돼 제거래 제사다 디 등을 모두 제도 디 간스 용아래라나 제사다 아주 레다 녀모 온게 풍부 깨와 렘바 될라 되는 용거래스 제사다 괜 차상다 레다 녀모 온게 주위기 풍부 디 괜래 디 노트 차상 디 괜래스 한다 제사다 레다 녀모 온게 준비 풍부 디다 닝보 민도 델레 타르진 델레 타르비게 타르비 고바 토고도 타르바 토바나 데네 레다 녀모지도 데네 강아디게 차상을 파 세주고리 예스베게다 돈다 닝보디 아주 너저 데네 게 몽보 제디 레다 녀모지고 공보디 괜데 에세다 델레 데네 용어 임바데 가서 하고 그러봐 데네 하고 왜 토네 데네 뭐 델레야 이중으로 이렇게 고고래 에세다 돈다 닝보디 가서 가서 데네래
Good afternoon. So last night we continued to look at the presentation on the Eightfold Division of Suffering, and we looked at the seventh, the suffering of seeking what you desire and not getting it, and we then also started to look at the eighth, in brief, the five appropriated aggregates of suffering. So certainly the first seven of this Eightfold presentation really is quite clear. We can read the book and understand it without much difficulty at all. But the point of the reflection is to come to know suffering, which means that one needs to recognize these sufferings at the coarse level presented, at the subtler levels that we experience it in life, so those that aren't abundantly manifest, but most importantly, that the very reason that we suffer, and this comes out in the eighth one, is because we have these appropriated aggregates, these appropriated contaminated aggregates, which are so because, or which are naturally subject to suffering because they came about independent on contaminated karma and afflictions. Therefore, because we have these physical mental aggregates, we suffer. And we suffer in the ways presented. So in the eighth suffering, it starts with word in brief, because it's the seven before our way to come to understand this eighth point. And we need to come to recognize again, not just the suffering in the coarse way it's presented and the subtler ways we experience it, but that it comes about independence on these causes, contaminated karma and afflictions, so that we give rise to the determination to abandon these causes and gain freedom from cyclic existence.
Nyelenyi pungpo ranshin yu kowa le kyowa namashi makena tarpa dunye yu lo namashi kesa mechings. Da semjin kowa kyanpa la niji chenpo yang ketab mebe taba chechung gando ju kyang samba dida bodi samba di shindu ka chewo sa.
Now we turn to the text from where we concluded last night, which is the final sub-outline here, which is some advice. So at the very bottom of page 161, if no genuine disenchantment develops towards cyclic existence, which is in the nature of the appropriated aggregates, there is no way a genuine mind striving for liberation will develop. And great compassion for the sentient beings wandering in cyclic existence cannot develop either. Therefore, these contemplations are extremely important, whichever vehicle you enter, the Mahayana or the Hinayana.
Sanda nyelenyi pungpo ranshin yu kowa la kyowa namashi makena sidda deshida dire da ngazuge nyelenyi pungpo sayadi da ngazu leda nyomo kishibi pungpo diche nyelenyi pungpo diche de la ba pe kyowa 나마시키 오래서도 텔레닝보 민도 삼비게 셈바 셈야 템부 슈지 베네 슈 첨부시키 오래서 오다 되게 균 통하지 배다 텔레닝보 민도 교와서 아다 야보 민도 닝보 민도 삼비게 나마시키 오래서 되네 마제바이나 안데 지게 야 탈바 토국도 셈베 타바 되니 율로 야보실리기 말해서 오다 이게 말해서
The reflections through these 8 sufferings need to come to us to recognize that the very reason we suffer is because we have these appropriated aggregates which were gained through contaminated karma and afflictions, and we will continue to suffer life after life after life. And this point was made here in this 8th of the eight sufferings with the 5 sub-points. And this then reflection needs to lead to what we have here in the sentence at the bottom, page 161, that disenchantment towards cyclic existence needs to develop. And this disenchantment needs to be developed so that it's not fleeting or sporadic, but that it's stable and transformative. Without such disenchantment towards cyclic existence, in particular, what it refers to is having these contaminated, appropriated aggregates. Then, as it says, which is in the nature of the appropriated aggregates, so that far. So the stable, transformative disenchantment must be developed.
ane jamni jian ji tu ma le jamni jian da ko yu du ha de ya le da nyu mo ko la ni bo min du san bi lo na ma ji ma ge ba ina ane jamni jian ya wo ji tu ma le ge be ta me es.
It continues over the page explaining that this process of dependency, that one needs to develop powerful and stable or powerful and transformative disenchantment towards cyclic existence. And if one fails to do so, one will not give rise to a determined attitude to emerge from suffering and strive for liberation. And without that determination, this determined attitude to gain freedom from suffering, one will not be able to develop actual love and compassion.
신도 가침보 치오시도 당도 태바 챔비게 람냠네 지게 임바다나 다 태바 중요히 람냠네 제베나라 데네 가를 람는 냠네 제베나 코 레다 녀모지 코 레다 녀모 옹이 준비게 풍보들래 님보 민도 산비로 로디 님보 매바 통회 로디 빼마서 예침보를 해서
Reading the last of this paragraph, there's no way a genuine mind striving for liberation will develop, and great compassion for sentient beings wandering cyclic existence cannot develop either. Therefore, these contemplations are extremely important, whether you enter the vehicle of the Mahayana or Hinayana. So one needs to develop this powerful disenchantment for cyclic existence, recognizing that there's nothing to long for in cyclic existence, believing it can bring happiness. There's nothing of abiding value. There's no essence to be found within cyclic existence, so nothing of abiding value worthy of yearning for, of striving for. This recognition is essential.
Lakisini ma shivana shinji nang samdada na nyingbo de samdada garas tangora sen dang du chene de chene ta sosyo phungbo de la samda ta ngi phungbo de da le da nyomo oi chung phungbo res ta ko da dunga den ba le da nyomo oi phungbo se duji phungbo sa de ngi su phungbo de da duji phungbo res je duji dunga res le da nyomo oi chung de re de res 제단다 레다 녀몽을 좋아 인자 안에 체델이야 기회 동안 가위 동안 나위 동안 치위 동안 차사 델레트는 연구도 와스 랑게 대비 되는데 마주비 동안 안에 랑게 제니 되바다 제위 동안 안에 미디어바다 체비 동안 되게 안에 델레트는 연구도 와스 도스전에 안에 도 삼다도 있어 제단데 레다 녀모의 풍보들 균되는 연구도 선배가 삼다도 당이 가르치는 연구를 하시는 풍보들 했던 연구를 풍보들 가르치는 레다 녀모 옹이 중화 인자 레다 뉴모의 샤왕도 규수 바래 풍복콜라 라왕메 바 레다 뉴모의 샤왕도 규수 바래샤 최선 델레 디인자디 용고래스 디네자다 레다 누시는 균통 사회절이야 다디 디야당도 끼지끼지 지바 끼지끼지 지바 빼 누가셔야지 남상 규르제 끼지끼지 규르는 용고요 바다 빼지 템부메바 따고 템부메바 디네 규 용고요 바제스 두 삼단에 삼단 세회절에다 균인조제 망보르지 크생한 쉐바나제 균여바 통화사라바 통화사대 가르쳐서 다디 얘다 녀몽의 풍보되다 닝보 균이 민도와 산비게다 델리아 신차 제고야다 배직 제고야 민도 닝보 균이 민도 산비 삼로시 다디 데니게 균야네야 삼단에 데니에자 레다 녀몽의 풍보될 닝보 민도 산비 삼로디 야네야도 고고다 가지디 전다디레다 디 델라 가소레 코알레 교화시도 닝보면데 야고 민우선배 삼는 남아세 배지 양에 야도 좀 많이 바래 기어나 되네 양 계속은 숙천부 개바이나 되네 가르쳐 와서는 다 딜레 탈세 탈바데 막 탈바세 토구도 대다 녀몽이 중 빵배 빵바데다 가서 풍보데 레다 녀몽을 중앙자 녀몽바 레다 녀몽보의 중앙에서 녀몽바 빵구도 녀몽바 빵배 빵바 탈바세 토구도 선배 탈바 토바이나 데네기 동아디 강아디 아요 막 제사다 탈바도 맞으면 탑민도 제사다 미 탈바 토바 지기 거기 동안 타달을 죄위게 탈비 탈바 맞으면 탑민도 선배게 나디 삼로디 기고 다디 야네야도 공부를 나 타바더니 삼로세디 디 야네야도 공부를 해서 당도 공부해야지 디지 김제 망보시비 김제 망보 삼당네 도나닝보 거미야디 얘들 녀모지 풍보들 닝보 민도 다 텔레 탈세 탈비고가 톱구도 선배 삼로디 야네야도 공부를 해서 그러다.
When engaging in this meditation, you have the 8 sufferings, each with their 5 points, and one reflects on these. Always, and the way to reflect on them is to recognize the reality of what is presented in each of the points, that this is actually the case, and think of your own experiences there, and come then with each of them to each of the sufferings whatever you're meditating on, to recognize that one's situation is not static. We relate to ourselves or our situation as unchanging, whereas in reality, we are in a constant state of flux, of momentary change. And in the context of suffering, this is to be understood as we are transitioning constantly from one degree of unhappy experience to another. Sometimes it's intense, sometimes it's quite mild, other times it's this what we consider happiness, but it is an illustration of the suffering of transient happiness. So to recognize this process of momentary change in all the meditations that one does on suffering, so that's one key point. Second key point is to keep coming to the same conclusion. I am in this situation because of this body and mind, my physical and mental aggregates. These are are naturally subject to suffering. As long as I have such aggregates, I will suffer. And this is not something in my control. I don't will suffering upon myself, and I cannot will it away. It's not as I don't have freedom over this. But because the situation has come about independent on causes, if the cycle gets interrupted and eventually broken, liberation from this cycle can happen. I can gain freedom from this process of circling in cyclic existence by breaking this process. And this is done through eradicating the causes, the afflictions. So this is the outcome of each reflection. It has these 3 components: meditating on the suffering, meditating on this process of constant flux, and then leading that into recognizing that we are in this position because of having contaminated, appropriated aggregates. but freedom is possible. So in this process, especially when one is doing this meditation often, what should be arising in one's mind when one's reflecting on these contaminated, appropriated aggregates is this mind of disenchantment, where one is maybe you could even say it more strongly, really becoming fed up with this situation, where you've had enough of it. This is important. And this mind that from this perspective is quite negative, because it's negative in the sense of I'm fed up with my situation, needs to be stable. It needs to eventually be uncontrived. This is then, in the same meditation, leads on to the point of I have to abandon the cause of this situation and gain freedom. And that then is the positive mind that follows from this. So this is important. So again, the meditation, you meditate on suffering, you reflect on impermanence, and you come to, then you meditate on the role of contaminated karma and appropriated aggregates, leading to disenchantment, and developing the determination, the final point, the determination to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds.
Penachalane, she chashing me when you were the music of the fire, you share some dama, the Tapoja, Bisha, some timber. Chisada, Dele, Tardic, some Kigore. As a Nimbo maybe told you, Dele chashing Kimare, chashing my kid, Dele Tardic, some Kigore. That answer you like a king or a sin. Aunt Pumbotella, chashing bear, but a Shukshimbo, Shukshimbo Shure. She's not the garrison and the Nimbo maybe Guindi, Hamo, Sida, Manzuki chashing she would kill her. She's not chashing she would kill her. 지난 차신 디 경기 아주 가리네 직자와 가르치네 직 차신 디 원도 송 레가레요도 다 탈두게 삼바게 탈바 도지 삼바 마게와디 되네죠다 지산다 제제 된다다 닝보 메바 통도 차신 기기 말 제가 차신 기기 말해서
The whole purpose of these meditations is to develop our wisdom so that we can come to recognize how things actually are. Because our problem is, we believe that things that have come about in dependence on contaminated karma and afflictions, these have an abiding value. That if I obtain them, happiness will come. And this relates to just about everything. So the problem we have is exactly this. We believe that things, phenomena, have an abiding value. But what we are trying to get to with this meditation on suffering, coming to this point of disenchantment, is to recognize that no phenomenon or state within cyclic existence has an abiding value. In other words, one cannot attain happiness by means of them. Attaining what we desire in cyclic existence will not actually lead to the happiness we yearn for. So this meditation challenges our attachment, leads to our attachment being reduced. This is essential to give rise to a mind of liberation. Because if one is attached to something, one is not going to want to be free of it. One will want to grasp onto it, hold to it tightly. This is what the mind of attachment desires. But when we recognize that what we are grasping at with our attachment, or clinging to rather, that cannot lead to happiness because it has no abiding value, then our attachment fades and a genuine mind of liberation can arise.
Di kala di luba subola nyugi yoba chötenla nyugi ba gyumze mabu samda samda nyugi yoba gyumze yane yado samda di shine di yung gyumze samda de dene o nyugi de gansam chilo o da di de sagi mindu sambege samno chkoryo de dele kala dele cha shen ba ne ne kala de sa de meba an dile do sho na chötinge kala sa de den den ya de yung go ba da jing an zui da na di so da ji ba cha go ba.
So let's just take one illustration, but you can maybe think of this and others in your life, where let's say there's a particular type of food that you really like, but you perhaps develop an allergy to it. Every time you eat it, you get ill. And eventually you recognize that the reason I keep getting ill is because I have an allergy to this food type. If I eat that, I will now get sick. And immediately you will refrain from it. And in fact, not only will you refrain from it, you won't need to refrain from eating that food with willpower, but you'll do so with a revulsion, because this food that up to now you've always seen as something that caused excitement because, oh, I'm going to get something delicious, you now recognize that causes pain. So you have an aversion to it, a repulsion towards it. This is what we're trying to get towards in relation towards cyclic, the objects of desire and cyclic existence. To recognize, actually, because they feed my attachment, strengthen my afflictions, they are strengthening my chains in samsara. So in this way, by meditating this, attachment to cyclic existence will break.
자다디 먼저 레다뇨 풍보들 닝보 민두 선비기 균다 될 착신 지교 말에 라면도 양고 너는데 될야 어 풍보들야 안다고 잡교 말에 니 야고요 말 남사 두신다고 잡교 말에 될라고 말에 다고 잡고래 다가대야 먼저 풍보들라 류딘 될라 때네 계주 주야게 당아서 미 류딘 될라 때네 개봉 계주 주야게다 약쇼디 된 될라 차더래 제가 딘데 텔레 때는 아주 계주 개심을 좀 두고 탈바다 탐지기 먹고 또 람냠는 차상 제도 거래. 제가 딘이 인자 아주 후보도 다고 잡고 거래. 다고 잡고서 다고 잡상데 가는 스켜고서는 달래다 녀모 우리 중에 풍부래. 달래 닝보요 말에 스베게 대도스 닝보 매바다네. 달래 차신 매바제. 차신 매바데 직 제제. 다데네 나 삼당나 찍리야. 다 차심해 봐자. 디토네 다 가르쳐 왔어. 다디 코발에 탈비게 탈바 토고 거래. 탈바 토발라 당아 디봉게로 제고 거래. 디바봉 개와 주고 냠는 제고 거래. 디 냠는 제디 띠니다 류딘 딜에 라바시오 말했어. 제사다 류딘디 데네게 냠는 제 계주 주발라 류딘 디 고고도스. 데네 인자 땡이 계주를 냠는 탈바다 탐지케 먹고 뭐 토바 주발라 류딘디 빼 계체 버셔. 디 인자 류디 하는 아주 그 지게 야고치 다고 잡제 강한 마태고 류들이 내 나서 슈침보다 야고 다고 맞겠나 내 나서 슈침보다 되니 돈에 안에 류 냠고 차가네 벤 냠소와이나 되니 맞아 계절 냠는 지도 말에 된 탈바타가 주 람냠는 지도 말에 지다다 류딘디 탈바다 탐지기 먹고 뭐도 람냠는 제발라 류딘디 안다데 류딘디 야바도 거에게 예첨보지 레샤스 진에 두섬다제 맞아 류딘디 다고 야워디 고 탈바다 탐지 김별 람냠는 제발라 고여봐 개발 판도도 선비 돈에 아니 다보자야 돼 마도 착신 돈에 다보자야 말에 제사다 되네 판도도데 닝보요 말에 고 레다 녀모 주와 내나자데 되네 강아먹고 퇴쳐줘서 제네 닝보 매바 통 될야 아니 탈두게 삼바지 된 탈바 탈비기 고바 토발라 남년 제발라 딘디 고바도 제사디 류딘디 다고 야고 야고 선비 삼다지 두스진 다고 야래 제사당은 좀 류딘데를 최된제하다 다고 야다 자사 제사 류딜레 레다 녀모 균몽 보여봐 닝보 매바다 닝보 매바 될레 탈두게 삼바지 제연도 제사 류디야 아니 냠는 제발라 고고 제바지 제사 탈바 탐지키 먹고 뭐토에 람냠는 제발라야 아니 류디 다고 야고 예선비 두스진의 삼다 제고마도 양지 닝보메 바다고를 남사 먼저 어다 닝보요 처마데 가르치나 제주 다고 잡교 말세 고에 인가 요라디 말에 다고 잡교 말에 숨고 말에
in each of these in each of the meditations that Lama Tsongkhapa presents on the 8 sufferings, he concludes with mentioning that one needs to meditate on this repeatedly over a sustained period. And as I've explained, what you really are meditating on or coming down to is that nothing in cyclic existence has any abiding value. This is what one needs to keep meditating on. And by doing so, one is developing one's wisdom in the sense of looking at samsara with a mind of wisdom, rather than the mind of confused ignorance, thinking that samsaric delights will lead to the happiness we crave. So in this process of developing our wisdom, we are developing a way of thinking which is radically contrary to the way of thinking of our society, and therefore the way of thinking that we've had our whole life. So therefore, one needs to ensure that in this development of our wisdom, in this developing and a disenchantment towards cyclic existence, that we don't go off to an opposing extreme. This can happen all too easily. And here I'm particularly referring to the need to continue to look after one's body. Because if one is meditating on one's physical, mental aggregates, recognizing that they have been appropriated, they are contaminated, and then one gives rise to a mind of disenchantment, one may well think this body, looking after this body doesn't matter. Taking care of this basis, the physical basis for my life, it doesn't really matter. It's contaminated. It's contaminated. That way of thinking is falling into a new extreme. We are not developing wisdom so that we can replace our previous state of confusion with a new state of confusion. We need to also recognize that these aggregates, whilst they are appropriated and contaminated, they are actually the ideal basis to cultivate the causes that will lead to liberation. There is no better basis that we could hope for than this precious human rebirth. So therefore, we need to look after our health. And here, in these meditations, you're looking closely at your experiences, at your mind, coming to know yourself well. So now, in this process, one should then be moving to look after one's body, not with attachment, but with a mind of wisdom or intelligence, that I'm looking after my health, not because I want to be seen in a certain way, but because I need to be healthy so that I can continue to practice, continue to train my mind with as few obstacles as possible. So one will still look after one's health, exercise and eat well and so forth, but not so that one can look good, but so that one can be healthy. And do so with a genuine attitude of taking care of one's health without the mind of attachment for how this body is perceived.
지금 잠닝지게 발라 셴심전 동화단 자료게 삼보지게 오르와 지금 셴심전 동화단 자료게 삼바게 발라 다 소수기 냠용도 여바 있나 다 레다 냠용 가지고 풍부했더라 강아데네데 용거에서 배삼로지 두시 제바 제제 소수기 다 되는 닝보메바 통 여바 있나 네 셴을 삼다베나 오코 풍부 레다 냠모죠 직바래 다디 콜라 나요래 가와 요래 가위 동안 나요 동안 치유 동안 되네 되베드나 미드베드나 나 미드바다 체베 동안 차사되네 용거에 선배 삼다에도 다 닝지에 선배 삼로디 레고래 근데 되네게 삼로시 따라 소수기 담보 삼다지 냠냠지 마사메나 파저들이요 바디 되네 중어바디 하고 도 말해 하고 마도나 셴여 동안 용타디 야고 하고나 셴레 닝지 야고 기도 말해서 지산다 셴레 닝지 야고 제발라 셴야 강한 태랑 강한 용타디 야고 하고 그래서 디하고라 소수기 담보 소수토네 냠냠토네 소수기 두신 삼다 야고 하고나 셴레 삼다나 데라와레스 되네 잠니지 기도 그래서 지산데 동안 용타디 강한 용타디가 되네게 하 먹어 봐 있나 셴레 닝지에 세 칸에 라바자 마도 닝지 야고 기도 말해서
And another crucial point Lama Tsongkhapa makes in this paragraph is that these meditations that are being presented, well, firstly, you've already heard that these trainings that are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity are the preliminary practices to develop bodhicitta. And here he makes this point by saying without doing these meditations, one will not develop great compassion. So by meditating in the way that has been presented, which is all about looking at one's own lived experience, seeing how one experiences suffering in these 7 ways, because, in brief, then the 8th way of having these appropriated, contaminated aggregates, developing then a mind of disenchantment in relation to one's own situation of being bound in this prison of samsara, and developing a determined attitude, I will gain freedom from samsara. All of these meditations are looking at one's own situation. So how then is this a preliminary for compassion? So these meditations, as I've mentioned a number of times on suffering, need to keep coming down to really the 8th suffering here, the suffering of the suffering of all pervasive conditioning. So in the threefold division, the 3rd one, the suffering of all pervasive conditioning, which is that we have these contaminated, appropriated aggregates. This is what we need to recognize in our own condition, because when we've recognized it in ourselves, we can recognize it in others too, because it is this level of understanding of what is meant by suffering that is the basis for great compassion. So to express this maybe more clearly, the basis for generating great compassion is recognizing that all sentient beings, just like me, are suffering due to birth, aging, sickness and death and so forth because of having these contaminated aggregates. May they be free, gain their freedom from these aggregates. That is the basis for compassion. That, therefore, and one needs to come to realize that that level of suffering in relation to one's own experience, giving rise to the determination, I have to gain freedom from suffering. Only then can we have a genuine wish, may others also gain freedom from suffering. Because if we are still acting in ways, if we are still believing that in samsara happiness can be found and we're following our attachment, how can we really say, I have a genuine wish for others to abandon the mind of attachment when we still believe that objects of samsara can lead to happiness? So therefore, these meditations in this way serve as the basis for compassion, the preliminary for compassion.
Andinege, ta jesa nganjugi nyamlen jibe kabla tangbo na sosugi tendo samtang horis. Jesa sosugi tendo da denege dungai samta dene ane duji dungadige samta dene samta yapo chaadu dene pa kapo she semje 탐제라 samta wena dene jamniji kiale la hayungores kasene 소수기 냠뇨 싸싸와 베네 하나도 뒤로 와다 베네 시빈징 아주 시빈지 사제 안에지 조지 뇨베나 안에 같이 조지 뇨셔와 안에 다 미션다지 시빈사 통도 오고 조딘 연구를 시빈 아주 소화지래 저와 시빈 뒤에 마상한디기 기사만용한디기 안에 시빈사나 카타고 요래서 신고할 때 이내 파주 현다지 시빈사한테 통화도 같이 요래서 삼르마도 미시기 소화시라래요 말하다. 그래서 냠뇨 소식이 아주 손 녀마 미치 손 나뇨와 있나 미신다지 손 나기도 라비어도 오닥 손 안에 강아되는 요래서 미시기 소화지 카니바시에 더여야가 오래 미시기 셈 나로에 소화 중요해요 말하다. 소 균에 나만용한 지기 미치 손 나기어서 아까 나기 요래서 비 삼르지 용도 연구해서 디제기 손 나용한 냠뇨 유행지기 소화게 받아 혼이bat 그런 소화 가갈리고 받아. 그래서 나 영한디기 미시기 소화 가질리고래. kunye labna do son panagore labna jibare de sem nala ya 소디 숙취서 하셔봐요. 안디나심 당한 저거 소식이 내다 너무 중요 풍부디 동아인데 망고 이바 김전도 삼단 김전지 배 하고 하지 닝보 매바 통화되는 디기 다 하고 되는 지기 소식이 두 삼다 하고 와 있나 대신 현대의 동안나와 삼다에도 남사 소화디 숙취 무실래제 다 건조 동하다 말한다 타면도 건조를 동아대 로바 지고 선비게다 삼도 숙심을 내두고 걸어봐다 당한 주길라 되네기 톤에 샤라라 메드게 나강아 어디 강아 요르디 세고 월스마데 디지라 삼나는 소 숙심을 내두고 말 지산 되네자 당보 되네기 톤에 삼다웨나 샤리아 잠니지게알이야 판도 침보요레 되네게 소소 나오는 냠민 냠뇨 되네지 마중웨나 샤리아 삼다웨나 잠니지 야고시기 두 말에서 너나지로 와다
This really is a crucial point to understand, because what's being presented here is an explanation of the actual preliminary, or a presentation of preliminary to give rise to actual compassion. And that is to come to realize in the threefold division of suffering, the third, the suffering of all pervasive conditionality. That is the basis for generating compassion. And one has to realize it in relation to one's own lived experience. If in one's meditation one is thinking about others and the mistakes they make and the problems that they are creating in their lives, and some compassion arises for them, that is not going to lead to a heartfelt seeing or recognition of the role all pervasive suffering of conditionality plays. So for example, if you've eaten chili before, so you know what chili tastes like, you can then explain to someone that what you're about to eat, it's going to have this particular taste. It's going to be quite fiery. Are you used to that? Whereas if you're just reading from a recipe book and you've never eaten chili, you may be able to say to someone, oh, what you're cooking is going to be hot because the book says so. But the genuineness of the way you're looking at the person, communicating with the person, feeling towards the person is going to be completely different. Perhaps a clear illustration is about toothache. So if you've experienced toothache, you'll be able to relate to someone who is suffering from toothache in a way that's quite different from if you've never experienced toothache. If you have no experience of toothache, of course you'll have compassion arising for this person who's clearly in pain, but you can't really relate to it. But if you know what it's like, then your compassion will have a far more stable, a more genuine basis. And so where, in our context of great compassion, when one has come to recognize the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality in relation to oneself, which is this eighth suffering here in the Eightfold Division, when one has come to recognize this in relation to oneself, then one develops self-compassion, the determined attitude, I have to gain freedom from suffering. That is the strength of mind required, actual definite emergence, a determined attitude to gain liberation. That is the basis for compassion for others. The strong attitude, others too have to gain freedom from suffering. With definite emergence having arisen, when one then observes beings blinded by confused ignorance, creating causes which they believe will lead to happiness, but will actually lead to suffering, the compassion that arises is quite different from a mere theoretical understanding. And likewise, one's communication, because it's coming from a place of genuine understanding, is again going to be quite different. So too, with a lived example, with how you live your life, will be quite different. So therefore, this is why one needs to meditate in the way explained, not just go straight to compassion, but one needs to meditate on suffering to bring about this transformation so that later genuine great compassion can be generated.
Dele o da le da nyu pumbo de la kanga de ne ki dunga ga yu du chi yu de ne yoro was bi da ko nyumbo me bu dimje ma mo ji ga lo le den ko dimje ma mo ji den ko re da ding ga lo jong che bi ge da ga dum je cha ko re chi sa da ma nam jin di ma je ba na pumbo de dunga ya kanga yoro sa ma do 예비 김장 가르가르가르 제가 잔두고 말하다. 그래서 만두 두치는 파 데데데 요래서 삼당에도 파 퇴삼 제제가 두치에 차베실 오다 레다님아 주 풍보디다 동아된 바래 시라요도다 대인비 김장들다 대치 동아된데 요래서 장갈 마서는 망부를 셈려야 젠두고와 대여도 되네 오다 가지 김장 망와서 젠투베네 님보 매바 통해 삼로도 숙치에 거와 그래서 당은 저 되네기 망부 개삼바디도 그 망보를 통로도 다 되네기 삼로 제여도다 예랭이 풍부한테 님보 매바 통위기 다 김장 망부시 젠투고 왔다 이간 저게 최삼 제백에다 좀제 차고래
The reason for this presentation, having so many points, you've got your eightfold division of suffering, each with their own 5 sub-points, is so that you can go through these meditations again and again, using as many reasons as possible. And this is imperative to bring about a change of understanding. Because what we are trying to do is to try to see something that has thus far remained invisible to us. So we're trying to bring about a radical transformation of how we experience the world. That all these pleasures and joys that pull us and the problems that repel us, to recognize there's no abiding value to be found in anything, and to let go of this way of thinking. So this is a radical change, and the degree of change required is that this is lasting, it's abiding, not just occasional, not just based on some on hearing teaching or reading an inspiring book, but that where one's way of thinking is completely altered. So this requires many reasoning with many modes of reasoning, so as to keep on coming to the same point. There is no abiding essence to be found anywhere in cyclic existence. Nothing worthy of my attention, of my desire, and rather to strive for liberation. So therefore, it's imperative one does the meditations in the way described. So that concludes then the eightfold presentation on suffering. Now we come to a sixfold presentation on suffering, further way to further presentation that we can use for reasoning to develop this mind of recognizing there's no abiding value in samsara.
Anadi gomolurubgi shirin ala karasongrasne shirin les ngeba meda ngeba meba dang ngom misheba dang yanda yando dorwa lu yanda yando dorwa yanda yando nizam jowa yanda yando tomando gyurwa ro mebege ngeba tru osongyores.
So now contemplating the 6 types of suffering. So first is a summary presentation from the Nagarjuna's letter to a friend. States the 6 faults of cyclic existence as firstly, lacking certainty, secondly, lacking satisfaction, thirdly, having to discard one's body again and again, fourthly, being reborn again and again, fifthly, changing from high to low again and again, and sixthly, lacking companions.
Dadi man dine trusno badi da jermi dine ma sumdu duishine sumdu dudes sede da summa duishe bana on kowala yiden jesameba di dewala jisam jeja ngomba mebeke ngombe tameba dadi ngomba meba sedire dangbodi yiden meba ngomba meba tameba dene Toma meba ne shubo o sedine sumnale ba duishen sungtua.
Then Lama Tsongkhapa writes that these 6 can be summarized into 3. They are, firstly, there is nothing reliable in cyclic existence. Secondly, there is no final point of satisfaction, no matter how much of its happiness you enjoy. And thirdly, you have been in it since beginningless time.
And this or that the Jing and the never say, Tambodilla, Commissioning on a said, the eating mirror said, eating the mirror said, that look there, your Marisoda, Lutobala, eating the mirror, and Yane and the Ludo was the Yane and the Insam Jaws, the Yane and do what the Gidine, that Jiggy, and Kies Harajala, that until some below the Escamar, the margin, Gabrielia, James and that Chenashi to Yan Jima. 로파 첨부천 마 시두고 제가 되네자 야네야도 도안 지 야네야도라도 양한께와실레 마시 양께와레시 아니 지 이된 균에 매되게 되네 내가 균에 가서 이된도 미루와레세 제자다 되네 야네야도 루도도 그래서 돼 야네야도 시고를 와서 거다데 류토발라 이된 미로 당아주 미류토발나 당아미 둔도에 가성의 동을 타장아 미류 탑사성에서데 발로디 해가요 말레스 제가 되는 마시네 아자 마시도 그래서 가브리엘 할레키네 마시로 되네가래 밀키네 시고 되네 지사 야네야도 류도 와서데 두시네 삼 제자 레다 녀모 원기 개월 렘바텔라 이대요 말에 야네야도 파 끼엔지 태도가 시두야 이제 시두고래 시된 류데 도르젠 다들 밀류 야고 토베네 류 도르제 류 제망아선 개반데 류 동안 누가 시되게 제사네 이대요 말 로디아요 말에서 오다.
So looking at the summary here in 2.3, the first, there's nothing reliable in cyclic existence. So this can be understood in several ways, but a key way is that in terms of relating to Nagarjuna's sixfold division, the first.
Sumba Dirisha.
Sumba Unikananti Kumbuludupne di Dhamma Yang.
Sumba Kumbuludupsha di Sumba di Yana Yado and Dorwa.
Ngepa Mare.
Never made the thing ever jealous.
Lu Yang
Yana Dorwa said.
Sorry, not the first, that of uncertainty, but the third, of repeatedly discarding your body. So here, whilst we have all attained not just a human rebirth, a precious rebirth, the reality of our situation is that whilst we have this excellent opportunity, this opportunity will end, and it is not clear what awaits us in our next life. Death will come. When and in the manner of our death, we do not know, but it will come and rebirth will follow. And that rebirth will be determined by our contaminated karma. It's not something that we have free will over. We cannot select our next rebirth. Our karma will determine it. So this third one, repeatedly discarding your body. This reflection leads us to see how life after life we circle through cyclic existence, sometimes with really a remarkable rebirth like we have here. But this is finite. This will end, and our next rebirth may well not be as remarkable as this.
And then Luyana and the Torah say, Yana and the Shiva, the Rameba. Rameba, Leda, Numo, so she made some Rameba, she immediately told the Danga Milu Yakotoson, that didn't Taharan digging some now in the Deg, one chair, Mahaso, change tin, Rameba, Yama, Led and Pempi, Nuba, so do Rameba, she took her was. Then Hale gets on that, then it has Lubu Yakush to that toss and big that ye dare Homer, the change tears in the Rameba, called my she to work. Says that Ram led a Numo, Java Tella. Mi Luda, Hey Luda, Luya was top in there, or Dangaya was also Jesus and big look, ye didn't get Gayoma, change it in Ramaba, she want to give a Ramaba, she to grace, Eva Shadow grace, as soon as that in it did Liana and the door say, the Ramaba, Yana and the she to grace as Ramako.
This. In the term repeatedly discarding your body, this repeatedly, we should understand that it means that this is a process over which we have no control. It's our karma, which was contaminated due to the afflictions, that determines what the process of when our body will be discarded and what rebirth will follow. So one can imagine oneself as being born in the God realms with all the pleasures, the delights of the God realms, thinking that this is how life is, not being aware of anything else, but that life too will come to an end. So a key point here with this term repeatedly is recognizing that this is a process over which one has no freedom. One is not in control of it, but it's our ignorance that makes us think we have some control.
Gulu do ala soba sang jumne nyangan le debi kombo te yorwa da lu do orwa ina diso rawa meba le da nyomo rawa meba do chago mare rawa yore de ina karresene and usually ya pendo dizemgi juwe meba ina da ne 갑들 lu pa 도스네 nyangal debi 수된 거래 그래서 다 내내기 아주 루사와 레지 샹달에 판도 개체 못 줘야 지고 그래서 대소 레다 녀모 온게 라마 메바 돌아와지 말해 다들 알아서 루디다 소소야 되고 섬나 샹리아 판도로 지하고라 지투여베이네야 룰라 고 팬비기 녀마기 레다 녀모 팬바 니번 소로도 시루고로 봐 라와요 말 그래서 다들 야네한테 돌아와서 루야 레다 녀모 라마 메바 시루고리스 세야 차고래
With a being such as Buddha Shakyamuni, the situation's quite different. So at the end of the Buddha's life, his body was discarded. But this was a process in which the Buddha was in complete control. It was something done under his own control, with his own freedom, his own volition. So it's a radically different situation from ourselves. So Buddha can decide, now it's time, that now it is of greatest benefit that I show the aspect of dying, of passing from this world. This will be of great benefit to do. So therefore a Buddha with freedom, with control, can choose to end their life. So there, whilst a Buddha does have to discard their body, or does discard their body, it's something that they have control over.
이된도 롱어 류차고 이된도 롱어 어다 로제 쳐야래 다 류리 렌체베실야 강아지서 동아디 요요 마데 레다뇨 뭐 라와메바 직 시줘야게 되네 강아지 요 말하다 지사 레다뇨 치위 동아요 마 강아요 말 지사다 소소로데 전주세마 파베게 되나 파베 토스는 코너도 꿀리 토요도 내 코너도 꿀리 디게다 이된 롱어로 차고래 그래서 나 레다뇨 뭐 라와메바 시줘야게 디 강아지 요 말와 강아지게 대세로 와 지사 디네기 류디 파 도르제 한게 류닝바 류 강아 동아야게 제 류디 요요 말로 컨트롤 당 안저 가서는 밀게 와나 대시 라마메바 시주래 대제야 류디 야고치르게 누가 얘기를 하고 말이야 가브리엘 베 류두 베네 나선에 깨는 나선 류디게 될 누가를 리거로 봐 어디지 디저와 지사다 전주선바 파파다 저점바디게 파공모데 류디 파 직 토바이나 되네 데솔이야 아니 치위게 동아 레다니모 라마메 베치고 돌와디 강아디 메바르 제사다 다 디소선나 다 로데로 이데 롱와데 데디 야고레스 비 이데로서 로데와데다 레서 디레서 로데쇼 로데와데소
So for beings striving to become Buddhas, or those striving for their own liberation, when they may have made sufficient progress, so those striving for their own liberation when they become Arhats, or those striving to become Buddhas when they become Arya Bodhisattvas, for them, their body is radically different from ours. So ours, we have is a basis of suffering, whereas theirs is a body that is reliable or trustworthy or stable, not at all like ours. they do not experience the sufferings of birth, aging, sickness, and death, for example, because of having gained freedom, because of having a body that has not come about in dependence on contaminated karma and afflictions.
Penny Jebala, the Gilo Sarson, Lutobala, Eden Miruane, Yana and Ludorova was Lazarvadang. Then some do be doing the some dura, some do send that to Dangbody doing the Shigura, some duba call Eden and Mirua said, and that Lutobala, Eden and Miruane, Yana and Ludorova was the Yana and the Shigri, the Shesarvada. That in Ibadilla, Penny Jebala, Eden and Mirua said it. Mirua said it. Just a deed don't that one machidua. Aging a Dangbola, some do join the Eden, call Eden just a meba chick. The devala Jisam Ju Yang, and won't be a tamebase, and then Toma meba and Shuba says she water. That Dangbo de Garelana, that he call Eden some meba, the Eden meba said it. Don't I share do Lutobala, Eden to Miruana, Yande, and Ludo was saying to share Sarada. Dangbola, she says to one. Then Lutobala, Eden to Miruana, Yande, and Ludo was said it. This is Sarada thing, you led on your more guinea, Yana and Sheila around your mare, she go and said, this is Sarada. And there are that in it, and Penny Jebala Eden to Mirua said, Shara. Yes, sir. That Penny Jebala Eden and Mirua said, that Sosugi, Odingalia, the Pandochi, he is a pay somebody over there, the Eden Miruare, Ongale never chicken, sometimes Eden Miruare, the Timbo Sky or Maresura, Dondala Timbu or Maresura, so the Penny Jebala Eden Miruani, that Benagar was in Pabuda. Midoani, Pabuda, Machumar Juada, and Ja, Shisu Jua, Sokla, Neba Os. I know that you did doom the order, I think. Can I ask your mother? Oh, that Lord, I did.
So sorry, there's just a bit of confusion going on with me. So going back to the book, the first has 4 points. So now to the second one. So this is actually what Geshe was explaining, but that hadn't been clear to me. Now I understand. So the first has 4 points. And the first one Geshe has just explained. It is inappropriate to rely on your body. You have attained, you will discard your body again and again. So that is I think it was the third point above. Yeah, the third point above, which in this division, so we have here in the first paragraph summarized into 3. So this first one, there is nothing reliable in cyclic existence, has 4 subdivisions. So this is now, the first has 4 points, of which the first one, again, I just explained. If you write it out in a chart, it's very clear. But if you present it like a textbook, it's very clear. But here, not so much. Anyway, so again, I just explained, this is 4 points. Number 1, which in letter to your friend is the third one. You have to discard your body again and again. Now it comes to the second, which is the second point of number 1 above. There is nothing reliable in cyclic existence. It is inappropriate to rely on benefit and harm done to you. There is no certainty as to whether your father will become your son, your mother, your wife, an enemy, someone very dear to you, and the like. So just to say from my side, if you haven't read it before today, read it a few times while Geshe is talking. The divisions are quite clear, but the way the book presents it is not what we're so used to. It's not like the way a textbook would lay it out.
Adi dire dangzu sumdu dudi kola yi den jasa meba se dilya the one man duini mashi dire shido. Adi da sumdu dudi yi kola yi den jasa meba se dinganzu dadi jasa di dona higoro wada. Adi ma dilya dona she yi den jasa meba dilya dina cikcik na kola yi den jasa meba jima dumiduwa. Dina ma yawa che de da yi den jasa meba dilpa hi cha yongduwa. 시 차용도 당보데 다가서 단단히 가르치고서는 코알 이된 제삼해바디 이된 미루와디 기시고라 데델라 안에 먼저 레다 녀모 옹게지 풍보디 미루지 톱다이나 아다 톱소선 비게 셈로디야 가요 말레스 데 라와메바 시루 그래 야네도 시네 인삼조루 그래 에서 직제 야다 지기 델야 안데 지기 소소레 판도 지긴지나 어다딩아 판도 제베 디세데 이된 제 가요 말레스 네, 가블레 판도 지엔디 가블레 자호 차리 가블레 녀버진 차리 사지 소소레 남균데 녀버진 자호진나 아가 자호레서는 이 베기디나 된자 소야스가요 말레스 니 규르체네 소소 년차 용고레 사지 어다 이 된제스 메바 델레야 디키시고로다 디시드 델레야 마시드 류도 야네야도 도와세디 직시에 사지 나 페네 제발 이때는 미루와세디 가르레세네 안에 소수기다 파다 마디기네 소수기 체대를 소수기 파마 이외나 다 소수의 펜이 소수의 펜버 두거를 와다 다지 당해디 다 펜버 두거에서는 소수 이때는 게디 이나디 펜버 두건 자기 레벨에서는 차양해 봐요 말이에요. 제자다 이된 제사 매바세다 유아 매바 랑게 파마드랑레 게딘 판도 제겐 파마디 다틱베 다 유아 매바 당할 판도시에 레선베 삼로다나 디고 말레스 유어진에 저에게 판도시에 말레스 가르레선에 가브리아 아니 지게 다디 체델이야 소수기 소설이야 로봇지게 판도지게 파마이메네 아니 지게 가소레 지말이야 시제네 대소 랑기 아니 지게 부를 봐 깨월해야다 다지 소수기 파판도 제고서게 차기오레스 제생 해봐요 말레스 안다도 판도 제바이나 제와치 말이야 지 소설이야 녀비기 해 요시기레스 제사다 다등아 판도 지게레스 띠네 주어메바 지그 주어 띠네 줘야 메디겐 이 띠무송에게 판도 지게레스 삼배 삼다나 띠 용요 말레스 용고 말레스 디싱도와 지사 미로와니 파부다스 가서 로마니 파부다스데 다데 소시게 파다 파마라나 장라 판도 지게레데 치마라 안에 소수가 부부진의 소수의 파판도 지간 제호야 차고래서
So in the section contemplating the 6 types of suffering, the 6 were mentioned at the beginning, and they can be condensed into 3. But how does 3 actually include 6? Because in the first one there are 4. Yeah. So that's 4 included in the first, and the remaining 2 are what we have in that first paragraph as number 2 and 3, making 6. So the first of the division of 3, which has the 4 subpoints, we've looked at the first one, which is repeatedly having to be reborn again, which is number 3 above. Now number 2, it is inappropriate to rely on benefit and harm done to you. This is the first one above. That of uncertainty, I think you're lacking certainty. So what this relates to is that the relationships that we have are uncertain, in that there are those that we are close to, those that we are distant to. We know that in this life, those relationships can change, but even if they stay stable throughout this life, as long as you've known someone, you've had a good relationship or a terrible relationship, and in this way it seems stable. In past lives and lives to come, it doesn't mean the relationship will always be like that. This is a challenge in cyclic existence, that our relationships are unstable, they are uncertain, they change all the time. We cannot rely on them in this way. So the illustrations that are given, the first one there is no certainty as to whether your father will become your son and your mother your wife. So this would refer to in the relationships we had in past lives. doesn't mean that they are expressed in the same way in this life, or the way relationships are in this life. There's no certainty that they will continue in this way in lives to come.
tembu shuji re samche samne de no re chesa danda la manzo takwa gyuwa meba tikedi nangi pamache de re simbi gyuwa meba samtai de no re de gyuche ne dada pamai ne mohba na sosu bu cha ru res dada sosu ge mai ne sosu mohba na sosu ge bu cha da sosu ge ne jige sada cha de ne chago chesa dine gyuwa ru ye me de takwa tembu de mares danda la ko tapa tembu samdai jigo mare tempa jiba tapa tembu gyogine joya meja samdai jigo mare chesan de gyuju ore saji dade denegi de gyuya de ko le da nyomo rawa me ba ko kichi dusun gyuju ore saji.
So this reflection is to challenge our grasping at permanence, that we relate to our relationships as being stable, or maybe more as static, as fixed. So certainly in terms of friendships, but also in terms of those particular relationships which you can say are fixed, in that a particular individual will always be your father in this life, and another will always have been your mother in this life. That's not going to change, but that is a relationship that that is not at all certain that will remain beyond this life. So if someone is your father in this life, there's no reason to think they will be your father in your next life, or were your father in a life before. So this reflection serves to challenge our grasping at permanence, at things being stable as unchanging, when even things that we can say is throughout this life, our relationship will always be one of parent and child. That is not the case, that it is always going to be, or always has been that. So it helps one to look beyond this life, but also to reflect on the changing nature of our relationships.
And the tower is a top of Timbu Mares, Yuriche Setelia, Sosu Yen Yuachayo, and Kiawanga Suzuki Yen by Nea, the Yen but top of Timbu Mardi, Yuriche Setelia, Sosu Tower Chayungores, Kiawanga Chisha by Nantiri, that settled some down in a low Kashigi Nielia, and the Sosu Mitumba, Dawa Chade, Mituma Chadena, and Jema Part, Chichambu, which and the Soso Dropo Chayungores. Nyama da pe drobo kawo shuji so tumbu shuji na yang di chelia mitumba chaje so so jawo gywa yongores chesa de so so kawo chaya da so so nyen ru bina ta pa timbu yo ma des so so jawo yin ta pa timbu yo ma de chesa kiji gyuru je an do sun gywa ro res.
Final example here, an enemy, someone very dear to you, and the like. Okay, so this relates to the relationships of those that we like and dislike, that these are uncertain, in that people who are unknown to you later became friends. Those that were unknown to you, they became known to you in a way that you disliked and you didn't get on. Or someone who's a dear friend, when one of you acts contrary to the wishes of the other, the friendship is harmed, maybe even destroyed. So this is something that we have so much experience of, but also the experience of someone that either you deeply dislike or who dislikes you. That relationship too can change. In particular, if one is helped by someone unexpectedly without them having to do so, and this person perhaps you didn't get on with in the past, by them helping you, this will change how you look at them. So our relationships with people, friend and enemy, this is not at all stable either.
교육이네 매바 돼야지 말이에요. 매바 말이에요. 자원이네 근데 그디 이내다 교육이네 매바 자원 장장시 돼야 돼 말이에요. 이제 매바요 말 갑자기 유로를 해야지. 또 나디 송도.
Yeah, the reflection really is to recognize that our samsaric relationships are uncertain. We need to challenge this grasping at permanence, at things being unchanging, thinking that this dear friend will always be a dear friend, or this person I despise will always be someone that I despise, and come to a deeper understanding of the nature of the relationships.
안에서 난다라 가르송고르세네 베네 야네 안도 류도와 세디 나란조 삼나라 가르여스네 나란조 끼와실린 사분 데케디나 교기니 도메 디타라 되되바직 다 시에기 시르 삼베기 다셈 딩려야 나조 려말에 진짜 따바 템부 지우 따바 신디여 따바 템부 슈 신디여 나서 베네 안저 가서 아니 마디지지 아니 마디지지 세디 바도 삼다 마오바나디지에서 제사 녀만의 제한데 나도 봐 지부지게 안 삼다데 나 뒤거라 마음바데 지지게서 다 나는 저라 삼노나리아 벤지 찐도 나야게 시에게 찐 잡고 채베네 채되베 나디 슈강을 연에 드누 어당에 자손의 디지긴다 내가 자손 디지긴다 시시디야 삼다인 거 제사 나도 삼노 딩리아 빼지 나도 딱바 템포 나도 류디 나도 깨와 렌서 유어기네 조에메 딱바 템포 슈지 진디거래 제산 디타바 템포 지에도 노트레스 제사당 아주 류디파 교와데 끼지끼지 유르진 바 조로 야네야도 두체마 찍게와 렌사나 교와기네 조에메데 딱바 템포디 말에다서 단다 지수고 제사다 안솔이야 딱바 템포지마 따선디 슈시무 슈슈어레 제산 디기 안솔이야 괜찮 슈슈고 제산 디 딱바 템포디 도아에게 단다라 대난주기 디두스 지루고레 세데 딱바 템포요 말에딘 두수숑고레 세세디리.
So these, of the two that we've looked at, both we should utilize in meditation to challenge this grasping at permanence, grasping at things being unchanging. So to talk a little about the one we looked at immediately before, the third from above, having to discard one's body again and again. The way we relate to our body or this life is as if it is unchanging. So for example, if you think about your future plans for later this year or for the years to come, you have your plans, you have your hopes, things you want to achieve. But the way we think about them is that the way my body is now is how it's going to be then. We do not take into account that this body is changing momentarily. The way it is now, it will definitely not be in the future. And how it goes, this we cannot tell, because it's something that we have no control over. It is something under the control of contaminated karma. So this is a deep delusion that we live under, grasping at things as being unchanging. So these 2 points we've looked at thus far, these in our meditation we can use to challenge this grasping at things as being unchanging when in fact they change momentarily. So both relationships as in terms of uncertainty, and then this body or this life as changing momentarily.
아니네 푼순 소바 통화라 이때는 미로와서 대해서 강은이 셰바도 원반미 배세디 있어요. 지난 푼순 소바 토바라 이때는 미로와니 네 토산에 마서 동화오스 야네메 도만 느끼와도 어디 야네 도면 예.
Then the third one, so of where the 6 sufferings are compressed into 3, and then the first of the 3 have 4 points. We're looking at the third one now. It is inappropriate to rely on the excellences you have achieved. You have fallen from high places to low ones. So this then relates to what we have above, the number 5, the 5th above, being changing from high to low again and again. So the more detailed explanation of changing from high to low again and again is it is inappropriate to rely on the excellences you have achieved.
아니 내기 나량한 저기 땅 엄마 매봐서야 지게 야내 양도 토만도 교봐서야 이용거로 디나리마 아주 풍순 소바 토발라 이때도 미루완 니 세대 땅한 저기다 나 풍순 소바 벤주 야고 안지게 벤주 섬다면에 소수기 벤주 야고 쉬고 토변에 디안에 이때도 미루와 따와 템부 말레스 되네 벤주 야고 치오베네 안디서 벤주에 되게 봐 교차 연구를 야만 벤주야 보시든 교차 연구를 다들 교부 쉬우시네 아직때 어떤 교부를 해서 다 땡케바 내봐 말해서 그디나 교부 줘야 말해서 땡지 태도 아직 벤주야 분수 소바차디 연구를 해서지 되네 송도 되네 토만 느껴봤어도 다다 원예로 토부를 지어비네 직배직 다 내봐 레베스네 딱바 띵부 레베스 딱바 띵부 말디야 유르신 아니 마살마 다들 권위 침부주나 제목 권위 매바 차야 마살이야 차기레스 다들 권위 매는 요시나 다 지대니기 디안 내바레베스 디안 내바 말에 제마 권위에서는 본부 그 프라임 미니스터에서 권위 토야 줘로와데 왕치 권위 토야 줘로와 다 권위 토보 줘베나 다디 따와 템부디 레베스는 따와 템부 내바 말에 호진지 제 유진 제목 권위 매바 차제 미규만한 차로 그래서 다른 아주 미규마 나신지 규마지네 다 규마라제데 땡케바레베선 땡케바 말이지 긴지 태번 마음반 한지 권에 토보차데 용그래 제자리 권에야 가브릴 권에 여바차 가브릴 권에 매바차 가브릴야 미 왕시 여바 가브네 왕시 매바차 여바디게 매바차 여바차 다 풍순소보 규풍순소보 변주하고 여바디게 마음반에 매바디야 여바차 두수요 제자다 간제래 풍순소보 여바에당 권에 ongchi yobai kada ten kheba ngeba rebesne meba mare tapatimbu mares disu gyurchene and the gyuwa yores adona disungore
It is inappropriate to rely on the excellences you have achieved. Just first to say as an aside, this term translated here as excellences, there really isn't a single term for this in English. It can be translated as the wonders or the marvels of samsara, but so it's a very broad term. So yeah, and it's hard to say look out for it because it's translated in many different ways depending on the context. So excellences here maybe understand as everything that we desire in cyclic existence. That all the things that we desire in cyclic existence that we either long for or we have achieved. That these are inappropriate to rely on. So here, think of, for example, material things that one has. So you can look at your bank balance or your worth, the value of your home and your investments. These are not appropriate to rely on. Whilst we may see ourselves as perhaps getting wealthier, that progression in wealth is not stable. That can change. For circumstances out of our control, controlled by contaminated karma. And in terms of individual possessions, we relate to them in a way that I have this, it's mine, it's going to last, and it does not. But the overall situation is really what is referred to by this term. So our overall situation in terms of our material wealth, also our status in society, and the power and influence that we have, whether it's in our home or in a place of work. This too is not something to rely on. It is not stable. So if one has a job with particular influence, and if one takes some self-worth in relation to the role one has at one's place of work, or perhaps in your family, this too is not stable. So all these things that we tend to rely on and therefore feels pain at their loss and overexcitement at their gain, this is mistaken. So in brief, what one has, one will eventually lose. What one lacks, one may well gain. This situation, whatever it is we find ourselves in, is unstable. So therefore, it is inappropriate to rely upon. So that then is the meaning of falling from high places to low ones.
나네 먼저 ngomba mibi dunga siade ngomba meba siade 가세 소세디기 당한 쪽에 세티 잠기 대 지기 디기로 치다 론저베네 다 디소 삼바 매와지 야네야도 지 야야지 고고로 받아 제 몸바 매바 좋아야기네 메다 디디고 삼베 삼 용거 말때 비야네야도 야야야지 고에 지그 론저베네 몸바 균이 매지가라 차고 그래서 왜디 아디지 데 지사디시 디제시오다 자 몸바 매바세 치랍시나
Going to the sixfold division, the second one there, lacking satisfaction. So the meaning of this is that whatever one has, one is not satisfied. One may be content for moments, for a brief time, but very quickly one will be yearning for something different, something better. So this is another suffering in cyclic existence, that we are never satisfied.
다 draw 이제 미루마니 draw 매버 draw 오세지.
Okay, and now back down. So now the fourth one, and it is inappropriate to rely on companions. You have to go on without them in the end.
다디 draw 이제 미루어서 당은 draw 취업에네 다디 유어균이 매버 더블 템포 돼야지 말이에요. 제가 유르치는 가블 draw 요번에 draw 매버 차도 그래서 안 draw 요번 매버 질이야 가블 draw 요번 차게 돼서 제가 이된도 중앙에 말이에요.
So this it is inappropriate to rely on companions. This relates to the one above, which is I think translated as friendless, lacking companions. So that's the sixth one, relates to the fourth one at the bottom. That whatever the relationships we have, in the end, they not only will they change, as we saw earlier, but the relationships will be brought to an end at some point in this life.
나 간절에 먼저 두서 다 먼저 콜위기 예미 삼다데 예미 강아테네테네 요래서 코월에 깨봐 있는데 용거 지상 코월에 깨봐네 레다 뉴모 라와메 봐 야네 야네 지기네 지도 니삼 좋아돼 용거래 제사다 데네기 소소기 지게 몸만 봐 지gle 롱주베나 지때 되바 칸메 봐 야네 아디양고 찍 대바 칼라 지 칼라사사나 never your mother, Yaja Jemasaho, Yaja Saho, Yasaho, Disaho, this one to let a new moment you pumpo di yoba is a di gunes, a let a new moment you mind by na, Trajan Bata Jajisma Papi Lula, Dennis Yomar, Yan Yajasa, the Disha Yomar was, just a momba meba said, Kala in the Yane and the Sawhite in the Yomares. Jezada. Tene luine leda nyomo rame ba yane and shiwa de yungo mares tene shungo mares yane ya do ani kewalen ba leda nyomo yane and kewalen ba tene yungo mares 제가 된 안주 여바디 가서 leda nyomo 풍부 여반사 디 바 yane and 시도 야야지 제 가브레 미리 가브레 하래 가브레 마소 개월도 생겨와 니 강한 차상한테 가르세는 안주 leda nyomo 중에 개월 렌시 풍부 지어바디 디유견에서다 동어주 삼바디 디견에서 도세 다 데네기 다 네바 템보마다 데네기 미줄이도 다 지켜와 렘바 따고 템보 짐바데 삼로도 노르레스 따고 템보 삼다교 말레스 고 규르제 끼지기주 규르제 규르도 두고 마다 게디나 소소 자워디 년지나 게디나 년자자시 되고 말레스 먼저 삼로 나가서는 배지 년디 따고 템보 지야다 랑궁wen이 주비 년이 진주고래 될래 자신기고래서 이제 되네 말레스 고 규르고래서 자워치 소소 마가 자워치 있네 다 게디나 따고 템보 균이 유어제 매는 자워디 말레스 먼저 삼로 나라 따고 템보 유어줘야 매데 랑궁wen이 주디겐 다치 소소 마가와지 진고래디 말레스 유르고래서 된다 디송고래
So if you looked at most of the six, so in the reflections, the method of the meditation is the same as in the Eightfold Division, in that one comes to recognize the faults of samsara by means of a different lens, so the sixfold presentation of suffering, But it comes down to the same final point, that I suffer in this way because of having these appropriated, contaminated aggregates. This is not the case for all beings. Arya Bodhisattvas and Arhats and Buddhas do not suffer in this way. This only suffer because of being under the control of contaminated karma. This is therefore what we need to come to in these meditations. And you go through the 6 points, looking at how things, the way we relate to our situation in samsara, both objects as well as our life, is through this lens of unchangeability or permanence. Whereas our relationships change. They change within a life, they certainly change between lives. And this is an important point to really get clear on, so that those that we have an aversion towards, that we soften that. Those that we have attachment for, we just be more realistic, using our intelligence in relation to relationships. And then likewise, in terms of what the material possessions we are attached to also recognize that no matter how much we consume, no matter how much we have, we'll never be satisfied, it'll never be enough. And whatever we encounter in cyclic existence, there is always an uncertainty. Hence, when we need to make a decision, it's difficult to be entirely certain because we are not in control. Outcomes, we do not have control over outcomes. A wide variety of causes and conditions determine an outcome. It's not something that is within our complete control. So we lack certainty, lacking satisfaction. This body needs to get discarded again and again, as well as changing from high to low, which is, again, looking at things in relation to a lack of certainty, that whatever we have with it, in terms of our status, our role in our family, none of these things are stable. So go through these meditations in the way described before, using illustrations from your own life, but keep on coming to the same point, to recognize that we are in this position because of having these appropriated, contaminated aggregates, and therefore I have to abandon the afflictions to gain freedom, so that I'm no longer blown about by the winds of karma, but that I can gain freedom from this prison of samsara.
동아 죽다 되네게 두수 강아 되네 열에서 삼다도 되네님보디 그 삼는 갈당 거서 되네 김전 삼다네 되네 레다 유모모 중에 풍보도 코어 될 되님보 민도 선배다 님보가 민도 선배 삼다 다 되네 님보 매바자 될레다 탈고 탈백에 탈제 타바 토고도 선배 삼로디 다 타바 토고도 선배 어디 삼로디 자해다 조디래다 디자에 타바 되니 삼게 되래 타바 토고도 담마도네 탑 민도 선배게 삼로디 다디 그거 저다 김제 먹고 시에와데 김제 되던데 님보딩아 삼다데 김제 현다데 예 먹고 삼다 톱네 야고 담 마토브네나 김제 지 삼다베네다 동아디네 여러 와서 삼다데다 레다 님모 풍보데 님보 민도 제자다 델레 타고도 타지 타바데 마토네 탑민도 세베게 삼다데다 타바도니 삼바게 고메데 디레 다 님보 민도 삼베 삼다데 양직 some jiglia 가서 어다 류딩 보면 될야 집에 통정 따야다디 지금 중급 매제바 이 말에 시사다 풍보디 님보 민도 이내야 다 탈바다 탐제기베 람냠는 제발라 풍보 딜마딘 바데 냠는 제투에 민도 시사디 람냠는 제발라디 고야지 레샤스 시사 되는 인장에 탈바 토구도 디터야게 된다라 딘 될야 지금 냠는 제고면서 딘디 야보주 고도 디인자 탈바 토야게 탈바 탐지킴 보고 봐도 람냠는 제기 띠엔들라 고우도 디인사 미류리아 아니 최대한제 송교체다 도시등이 다보야보教고 선배 삼다지 다보야디 염제들 다 삼다당지 니디 다또 계시셔딩이들이다.
So I encourage you to meditate on the eightfold as well as the sixfold presentation of suffering in the way that has been presented. Using examples from your own lived experience, so you're looking at your own lived experience, and keep on coming to the same point. I suffer like this because of having contaminated, appropriated aggregates. This is why I'm suffering. I have to gain freedom from this. So to develop this mind of disenchantment, a revulsion towards cyclic existence, a determination to emerge from cyclic existence. And to actually develop this, one has to use reasons. To meditate on one of these, to think about it now and again, this will not bring about change. One needs to meditate in a wide variety of ways, so the eightfold, the sixfold, and the threefold divisions too, using the way that the text presents. So they all have, the eightfold all have their 5 points, five points within them. And this is all, again, so that you can use as many reasons as possible to convince yourself that what you have always believed up to this point is wrong. That the way that the world is not how it has to be. That this is actually not a life of freedom, that these are things that will lead to pleasure and enjoyment, but are all bound within samsara because they have come about independent from contaminated causes, and therefore they have no abiding value. So as long as I remain drawn but to pleasures and have revulsion towards other samsaric phenomena, I'm continuing to strengthen my afflictions and create contaminated karma. I have to gain freedom from this. So this needs to be the final point of every single meditation. And then a second point I want to emphasize that you also take, because it's not mentioned in the text, but it's important, that you don't go to the other extreme and then give up on looking after this body, taking care of your life. This is another extreme. Don't go there. Keep a balanced approach. Recognize this is the ideal basis. Don't give hopes for, I'll have a better rebirth in the future. Now, I have the best basis possible. Let me make the most of whatever it is that remains of this life to accumulate the causes for liberation. So this then is the second key point to conclude the meditations with. Then thank you, and we can conclude there for this week. Thank you.